Shalom Aleichem, welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening for the Great Christmas Boycott of 1906 with Scott Seligman. Before we get started, a few housekeeping details. Your audio and your video will be off throughout the program. You may send us your questions via the question panel at the bottom of your screen. We ask that you keep questions short so we can try to get to all of them this evening, and that you refrain from sending comments so we can get to the questions. I'm delighted to introduce Scott Seligman, a national award-winning writer of narrative nonfiction and biography with an interest in the history of hyphenated Americans. He specializes in bringing little-known but crucial moments in history to life with drama and meaning. A former corporate executive who holds an undergraduate degree in American history from Princeton and a master's degree from Harvard. He has written 3 books on American Jewish history, including The Great Kosher Meat War of 1902, which won gold medals in history and the Independent Publisher Book Awards and Reader Views Literary Awards, and was a finalist in the 2020 National Jewish Book Awards. He lives in Washington, D.C. He is a very good friend and guest on our evening program. So welcome, Scott, and congratulations on your latest book. You're busy. And I understand from our brief conversation before we went on, this is the official book launch. So mazel tov.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great.
I want to thank you, Lisa. I also want to thank Elizabeth for setting this up. This is actually the 4th book I've launched at the center. And I'm grateful to you for asking me back each time. Well, the book I'm going to talk about tonight can loosely be considered the 3rd book in a trilogy. All of them are set in New York City in the very early years of the 20th century, and all of them concern struggles of its Jewish community in one way or another. Let's go here. The first of the books in this sort of trilogy, I didn't write it as a trilogy, but it kind of makes sense to talk about it that way. The first one was called The Great Kosher Meat War of 1902, and it told the story of Jewish women on New York's Lower East Side who took to the streets to protest the rising price of kosher meat that had actually made it unaffordable to many of the families. It really marked the dawn of Jewish female consumer activism in America, and it was a very interesting time, and a lot of firsts were kind of involved in that. The next book took place just a couple of weeks after the kosher meat boycott, and it was called The Chief Rabbi's Funeral. It was also on the Lower East Side. It tells the story of what I believe was the largest anti-Semitic riot in American history, and how the Jewish community and the city responded to it. And that was also launched here. And then this book, The Great Christmas Boycott, it tells the story of the entry of the Jewish community into the debate about religion, and in particular about Christmas pageants in the public schools. Now, just a little background here. I am not a native New Yorker, but I'm close. I'm a nice Jewish boyfriend, born in Newark, New Jersey in 1952, and I grew up in the same neighborhood as Philip Roth, only he was about 20 years ahead of me. And I went to Maple Avenue School, which was so overwhelmingly Jewish at the time, students and teachers, that the Board of Education could barely keep it open on the Jewish high holy days. And here I am at about 8 years of age. I think this was Mrs. Cohen's class, but honestly, I can't really remember. What I do remember about growing up then is that although I'm now well into my 70s, I can still recite the 23rd and 24th Psalms that I learned as a child, King James Version, verbatim. The text was drilled into me by the teachers, Gentile as well as Jewish teachers, who had no choice in the matter. State law from 1903 required the daily reading of at least 5 verses from the Old Testament in the public schools. Never mind the fact that my Hebrew school would never have ventured within 100 yards of that Church of England translation. And the reason that we knew the 24th Psalm in addition to the 23rd is the teachers got so damn tired of the 23rd Psalm, they would just flip the page. And people like me, with the memory of a young child, somehow we've retained it all. And I can still recite it. Not only that, The law also mandated the recitation of the Lord's Prayer, which comes right out of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. There's nothing Hebrew Bible about it. And when we recited it, believe it or not, we were told to fold our hands and bow our heads in prayer, even though you would not only never hear that prayer, but you'd never see anybody pray that way in a synagogue. Well, friends of mine who grew up across the Hudson River in New York City and are products of the New York City public schools have very different memories. None of them remembers Bible reading because they didn't do it, but several have vague memories of a daily recitation of something called the Regent's Prayer, which was an ostensibly non-denominational appeal to God for blessing. It's just a one-line long. That prayer, parenthetically, was at the heart of the 1962 Supreme Court case, Engel versus Vitale, that was the case that banned prayer in the public schools nationwide. And actually, that case was followed the following year by another case that outlawed Bible reading. And I lived through both of them. I wondered at the time why they suddenly stopped Bible reading at school prayer. And I think that probably had something to do with why this subject appealed to me as a book topic. Well, why the difference between New York and New Jersey? In the course of researching the book, I learned that the states and even individual communities within the states often went their separate ways on the question of what religion was and was not allowed in the public schools. And that you could trace the seeds of these arrangements back to decisions made, in many cases, decades earlier by variously state legislatures, governors, courts, boards of education, and sometimes just the school principals themselves. And in the case of New York, whose Jews had their plea for secularism in the public schools fall on deaf ears, it was due in part to a citywide boycott that they organized on the day of the school Christmas pageants in the year 1906. And this is a little remembered act of civil disobedience that's the main subject of the book. The book actually goes on to trace the history of this dispute to the present day. But in the interest of time, I'm going to talk about 25, 30 minutes today. I'm only going to, and I'll take questions after that, be very happy to. I'm really only going to focus today on the 1906 boycott. It bothered me as a kid that we were being taught to pray like Christians. And it has always bothered me that Christmas is a legal holiday in the United States. I've never understood why it is. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-Christmas. I love the songs. I know them all, Lord knows. And I love visiting friends with Christmas trees. And I've always looked at Christmas trees a little bit enviously. But I've never thought that the public schools were an appropriate venue for Christmas celebration. So I'll get that out there up front. I had a point of view when I started this book. I don't think it got in the way of my telling the story objectively, but I knew what happened and I wanted to write about this event when I first realized it. And that's why. So return with me now to 1905 in Brownsville, Brooklyn. Jews from the Lower East Side and some directly from Europe, actually, flocked to this particular Brooklyn neighborhood after the Brooklyn Bridge made it easily accessible in 1888. And at the time of this, in 1905, this community was overwhelmingly Jewish. And the story begins at PS 144, which had actually opened only the year before. And like Brownsville itself, the vast majority of its 2,400 students were Jewish. The principal was a man by the name of Frank Harding, who was not Jewish. He was Presbyterian. And he called an assembly in the middle of December in 1905. And he used the assembly, I should say that Harding believed deeply in the redemptive power of Jesus Christ. This was very important to him. And in this assembly that he called in December of 1905, he decided that his Savior's message would be beneficial to people who might not have heard it. And so he picked out a book called Gems of Wisdom from Bible Literature and Proverbs, which was essentially a collection of quotations mostly from Scripture. And he told the students that he wanted them all to be like Christ, and that, and this is a quote, Christ blesses all but the hypocrites, and the hypocrites are the people who do not believe in him. He forgives all but those. So boys and girls, be like Christ. That's the end of the quote. Well, these remarks did not sit well with a 14-year-old girl named Gussie Herbert. I'm afraid I don't have a picture of her. I wish I did. She was a seventh grader. She came from an observant family. She was pretty well schooled, actually, in her Jewish heritage, which you couldn't say about a lot of the Jewish kids growing up at this point. But she was. She had taken some classes. And so she screwed up her courage. She advanced to the front of the auditorium and she asked the principal why he thought it was proper to preach the Christian religion in a public school. She wasn't impolite, but she had a point and she wanted to make it. She wanted to ask the question. Well, Harding got kind of hot under the collar. He denied that he was preaching, and then he contradicted himself by saying, anybody whom preaching on Christ does not suit may have the pleasure of leaving the room at any time. And then he ordered her back to her seat. Well, Gussie got flack from a few of the Christian boys on the way home. They called her a Christ killer. They called her a sheenie, which was a term I didn't grow up with, but my grandmother explained to me what it meant. It was a derogatory term for a Jew. One of them spat in her face. And at dinner that night, she told her father about it. Her father was a man named Edward Herbert. He was an attorney, a prominent attorney, actually, and something of a Jewish activist himself. The whole story enraged him, but it did not surprise him because he was expecting something like this. And he knew exactly who to contact about it. He knew a man by the name of Albert Lucas. Lucas was, he was a British-born Jew. He was actually Sephardic Jew. And he was secretary of the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations, which we know today as the Orthodox Union. They're the folks who set the standards for kosher food and things like that. Still around today. It was founded just several years just before this, in the late 1890s, I believe it was. And so Herbert told Lucas the story of what had happened at PS 144. And Lucas, as it turned out, had kind of been lying in wait for something like this to happen. He'd even warned people to be careful of what showed up during the Christmas season, because it was often the case that Christianity would find a way to sort of seep into the public school. Lucas's mission in life was to make the world safe for Jewish life. And wherever he saw efforts to thwart Jewish rights, he was right there willing to do battle. He was fresh, actually, from doing another battle. He was battling with the Christian settlement houses. Now, the settlement houses were set up, in most cases, by Christian mission. They were missions, essentially. They set them up in poor neighborhoods. The Lower East Side was a popular one. And they provided needed services to the immigrant communities. Sometimes they would feed the kids. They would give them programming after school. They would help people find jobs. They really were a social service organization, but a social service organization with a goal. And some of them made no bones about the fact that they intended, if possible, to attract Jewish children and convert them to Christianity. And Lucas believed that not only was this an evil that needed to be routed out, but he began to believe that the public schools were also being used as a vector for proselytizing the Jewish kids. And as a result of what Frank Harding did, the local Jewish community quickly circulated a petition calling for his dismissal. And when the local Board of Education, there were lots of boards of education in New York in those days. There was an overall Board of Education based in Manhattan, but there were a number of individual local boards of education, including one that was in charge of this particular neighborhood in Brooklyn where PS 144 was. And when that local board finally got around to holding a hearing on the petition to get rid of Harding, they had two sessions in which students and teachers testified. Harding flatly denied the allegations. He said the students didn't understand him. The local board decided to err on the side of believing the principal because maybe the students hadn't understood him properly. And they declined to recommend any sanctions against Harding. But they were not the final arbiter. The final arbiter was the full Board of Education. So they bucked this up to the full Board of Education for either approval or disapproval, depending on what the board wanted to do. And where it landed in Manhattan was not quite at the full board, but at a committee of the full Board of Education called the Committee on Elementary Education. And it was chaired by a man named Abraham Stern, who was also Jewish. And some people thought that this was a good omen because a Jew would certainly understand the concern people had about Christmas celebrations and such in the public schools. But Stern turned out to be sort of a different sort of Jew from most of the people who had signed the petition. He was one of what they called the uptown Jews. These were the Jews mostly of German extraction who had come earlier, emigrated in most cases, their families had emigrated in the middle of the 19th century, not the late 19th century, which was when the Russians and the Eastern Europeans began to come in large numbers. And these Jews had prospered fairly early and had achieved a certain degree of assimilation among Gentile New York. And people like Stern were actually somewhat embarrassed by the later arriving Russians and Eastern Europeans because they saw them, there was kind of a mutual understanding, not only that they were sort of in the same boat, that they were the same people and they were brethren, but they also were threatened by each other. The German Jews looked at the unwashed Eastern Europeans and Russians as hopelessly backward. A lot of them had very little interest in assimilating in America. They just wanted to live their own lives undisturbed in the United States. They felt that these people sort of threatened their tenuous acceptance by Gentile New York. The Lower East Side Jews looked at the German Jews and they thought that these people are hopelessly assimilated. They would walk into a synagogue in Midtown Manhattan, one of the Reform synagogues, and they thought they were in a church. Men and women sitting together. Nobody had kippot on. Organs in some cases. So the two Jewish communities, they existed side by side. They sometimes came together. They often didn't. And there was mutual suspicion. So when they saw that Abraham Stern was the Jewish man was the chairman of this committee, the optimism soon gave way to the realization that Stern actually didn't see much of a problem in Christmas observances in the public schools. He was actually a member of a club called the Harmony Club, which had started life as the Gesellschaft Harmony, and only recently switched to English. It was German Jews, and the word on the street about the Harmony Club was that the unofficial motto was more Polish and less Polish. So Stern really was not much of an ally for the Jewish community in this. But his committee did record its disapproval of what Harding had done. And the full board ultimately concurred. So Harding got essentially a slap on the wrist for what he had done. And that was it. There were no further punishments of him. The truth is that Lucas and company were actually wrong in assuming that there was some sort of a conspiracy on the part of the Board of Education to convert the Jewish children. That didn't happen. But that didn't mean that some people didn't have that idea. And it didn't mean that there wasn't a problem with Christmas celebrations in the public schools. And what we saw, and to prove it, I want to show you an article that appeared in a publication called Frank Leslie's Weekly in 1905. It was a popular illustrated news publication, kind of like, I guess you'd call like Life magazine used to be. It had a publication, it had a subscriber base of tens of thousands of people. And in this article, they show a step-by-step how-to guide to indoctrinating non-Christian children with, quote, the symbols and joys of Christmas. The article asserted that the joy of gift giving of the Christmas season was the best way to, quote, improve the homes of immigrants. And it was illustrated with a full page of photographs of Lower East Side children over the caption, "Benighted children taught to celebrate Christmas." Now, the youngsters in the pictures were not identified as Jews explicitly, but it was pretty damn clear who the benighted children were that the author was talking about, because the immigrant Christian children didn't need an introduction to Christmas. The Jews were absolutely the target. And in the next couple of slides, I want to show you the other pictures. The first one was starting out to get the Christmas tree, and then bringing the tree into the schoolroom. See all those little urchins doing that. The third one is the tree with its loads of gifts as an object of admiration. And then the fourth one, delighted children enjoying the new and novel toys allotted to them. So Lucas wasn't wrong when he believed that some people did have the idea that even the schools would be a good forum for conversion, but it really wasn't the policy of the Board of Education. Anyway, So the issue went to the Committee on Elementary Schools. They recommended to the board that Harding not be seriously sanctioned. That's what happened. But and that's what the board did. But what the board didn't do was actually of more interest to Lucas. What they didn't do was to address any of the larger issues that were raised by the Harding affair. Harding had read the Lord's Prayer. Was that allowed? He had allowed Christmas trees and images of Jesus and the Virgin Mary to be displayed in the schools. Were they allowed? What about a Christmas pageant? Was that kosher? Wrong word. Was that allowed? Lucas followed up to ask the board for some guidelines to make sure that he wanted to make sure that nothing like Harding's assembly speech happened again. The board committee agreed that they would hear from the Jewish community before they made any decisions. And these were the members of the Committee on Education that were there. There's another Stern at the other end of it, Sam Stern, who's not a relation of Abraham Stern, but there were two Jews on this committee. And Lucas assembled a delegation of about 24 prominent Jews to testify before the committee. And among them were several Orthodox and Reform rabbis. He wanted to make it absolutely clear that the Reform and the Orthodox establishments were of one mind on this issue, and they more or less were. The establishments themselves absolutely were. There were a couple of dissenting Reform rabbis that didn't think this was a big deal, that thought the kids were not hurt by a Christmas tree, and that this was a silly thing to be making an issue over. But the Reform movement and the Orthodox movement, they were in sync on this thing. And they weren't always in sync. This was an interesting time. Each rabbi took a different tack in explaining why Christianity had no place in the public schools and why it was harmful to Jewish children. So the Board of Education was torn. They were really between a rock and a hard place here. If they abolished Christmas exercises in the public schools, they'd get a lot of pushback from Christians. But allowing them to continue would enrage the Jews. So despite the fact that Christmas 1906 was just around the corner, because this thing had taken most of a year to play out, they did what deliberative bodies that are not sure what to do have done since time immemorial. They did nothing, which essentially meant that business as usual. That when at Christmas time, the principals would more or less be free to do as they pleased. And this was unacceptable to Lucas and his colleague. It was the last straw, actually. They had done everything by the book. They had appealed this properly. They'd gone to the right bodies, but they simply weren't getting taken seriously. So it was time to raise the stakes. And after the students were told to come to school on December 4th, 1906, in their best clothes to take part in Christmas pageants, and that despite requests, Jewish children would not be excused from these exercises, the Yiddish papers called for a boycott of the public schools. And that's what this headline says from the Morgan Journal. Don't make me read the Yiddish. It won't be pretty. And mothers dutifully kept their kids home. Some schools were more effective than others. And how successful the boycott was in keeping children out of school kind of depended on which newspapers you read. According to the New York Times, they estimated that something like 25,000 children, about 1/3 of the Lower East Side school population, remained home. But the Yiddish papers, the Wahrheit and the Tageblatt, reported that many of the schools were largely empty, and that in Brooklyn, the absentee rate was somewhere between 50 and 75%. There was some debate, even within the Jewish community, as to how successful the boycott had really been. Because for one thing, some of the schools ultimately hadn't really needed boycotting. In those cases, the principals had gotten the message. And they'd either taken as much religion as they possibly could out of the celebrations, or they'd eliminated them entirely. And there was really no point in boycotting those schools, but they were boycotted just like the other ones. But the Jews had made their point, and their action alarmed the Board of Education. And the Committee on Elementary Schools finally, in January, submitted some recommendations to the full board for how they wanted to deal with religion in the schools or Christmas in the schools. And they were something of a compromise. The Jews basically won on 2 points and lost on 2 points. What they achieved was that sectarian hymns would not be permitted, which to me meant that Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer was fine, but O Little Town of Bethlehem wasn't. Nor would students be required to write compositions on religious subjects, which had been the case before. In fact, one of the rabbis had testified that his own daughter had come home and said she had to write a composition on Christmas for her teacher. But they lost on Christmas trees, they lost on holly, they lost on mistletoe. All of these would continue to be allowed, as would religious imagery. So it was half and half. It was probably enough to satisfy the Jews, but the problem was that it engendered a huge anti-Semitic backlash. And here are just some to show you. Here are some letters that were printed in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle in the next couple of days. There are some quotes from them. It's an insult to Christian parents in this city and to their children. It's an insult to the God of Abraham, the Father of our Lord, and the Savior Jesus Christ. Well, Father of our Lord and the Savior Jesus Christ, I get. God of Abraham, it seems to me the Jews had claimed. Nobody parsed that. Has it got to the point where all our American institutions have got to fall in line with Jews and Jewish ideas? If they don't care to have their children hear the Christmas carols in school, let them keep them home. And then my favorite, it would be more becoming of the Jew if he would show his appreciation of the favors extended to him and cease from interfering with the religious beliefs and institutions of the majority of the citizens in the country where he has found asylum. That one was the most appalling. The underlying assumptions here that Jews were either not true Americans or were somehow lesser Americans, latecomers merely tolerated by earlier arriving Christians. That Jews ought to be grateful for the asylum granted them out of the goodness of Christian hearts. That they should just be happy they weren't in Russia anymore and they shouldn't make waves. And then that if anti-Semitism increased as a result of this protest, the Jews would have only themselves to blame. None of the critics gave much serious consideration to the basic question of principle that was being raised by Lucas and company. Were the public schools an appropriate or even a legal venue for Christmas celebration? The opponents insisted on viewing the whole affair as a Hebrew attack on Christmas and Christians, a Jewish conspiracy to deprive Christian children of their legitimate rights, and to secularize, or according to some, to Judaize the entire country. Well, the Board of Education, which was not known for its backbone, when they saw the depth and the vehemence of the protest they were getting from the Christians, they backtracked. They pretended that they hadn't abolished sectarian hymns at all, which they had, and they washed their hands of the whole matter. What they did was they more or less dumped it in the laps of the individual school principals and wanted nothing further to do with it. It was a real profile in courage, which essentially meant that if there was a repeat of the Harding incident, they really weren't planning to do anything about it. Well, Albert Lucas took a lot of flack for this. There were recriminations within the Jewish community against him for spearheading an effort that had such paltry results. But for better or worse, in Lucas's defense, he did make the concerns of many local Jews impossible to ignore. And had it not been for his activism, it's very doubtful that anybody in authority would have given this issue a second thought. The truth is, banishing Christmas celebrations from the schools entirely, despite the strong legal arguments for it, was back then, and really as well as today, it was essentially a fool's errand. No matter how much Lucas and company wanted to fight a battle over the law, the outcome was always going to be decided by politics. Since there was never going to be much public support, or at least not majority public support for it, that pretty much guaranteed that the elected officials weren't going to do anything about it. Ridding the public schools of Christian influences was an issue that had always had a better chance in the courts than it did with the civil servants because it involved defending the rights of minorities. And much of that did happen, but it didn't happen until much later. It really was about mid-century that process began to take place. And it's not the end of the story, but it's the end of what I was going to talk about today. The book goes on to look at how the courts handled religion in the schools in subsequent years, and how the logical heirs to Lucas's crusade, which are essentially the national Jewish organizations, all of which were formed actually after 1906, how they've dealt with the Christmas schools, with Christmas in the schools, up to the point where today they have mostly declined to continue the fight. And they've moved on to other more winnable fights, I think, against Christian nationalism. And that's really where we are today. So let me unshare my screen. And I'd be very happy to take questions if you folks would like to ask.
Once again, Scott, a really interesting story. So I'm going to start with the first question. The timing of that regent's prayer seems suspiciously close to the inclusion of the phrase, quote, under God, into which the Pledge of Allegiance, which we were required to recite each morning in my Brooklyn public schools. I would stipulate that these actions were a response to McCarthyism and the Red Scare. Thoughts?
Absolutely the case. They were related, and that's just what it was. People were worried about creeping communism. They thought that the kids needed a dose of good morality and that there was nothing wrong with a little bit of religion in the public schools to do that. Absolutely on target. That's the truth. That's why it happened.
Was the battle for or against Christmas ever related to fears about intermarriage?
Interestingly enough, I'm writing about intermarriage right now, but no, it did not come up in my research about this particular topic. The truth is, intermarriage was not that big a problem and not that big a deal in 1906. It started to become one, maybe the 1920s. The immigrant generation mostly didn't intermarry. It was the children of the immigrant generation that did. I mean, that's an overgeneralization. Of course, some of them did, but it was really the 1920s and sort of beyond that when it became an issue. And there's a famous play actually that came out on Broadway in the 1920s called Abe's Irish Rose, which was the story of a Jewish boy who fell in love with a Catholic girl, and how that all worked itself out. And there was some Jewish protest about it, but there was also some kind of acceptance of it too in the part of the Jewish community. But in 1906, there wasn't a huge debate about intermarriage going on that I was able to find. Certainly not in this context.
Were any Jewish or non-Jewish women involved in this struggle/issue?
Well, back in those days, I'm about to give the lie to the Great Kosher Meat War, because that was very female-oriented. And the rent wars that followed were female-oriented, female-led. This one wasn't. This one was male-dominated, and that wasn't unusual at that time. Even with the Kosher Meat War, there were a lot of people that sort of wanted to talk about it as some kind of great feminist struggle because the women were in charge. But it really wasn't about feminism. It was about cheaper prices for kosher meat. And then women didn't care if the men got involved. In fact, they wanted them to get involved. But it was a time that most of the Jewish organizations were led by men. Most of the relationships between the Jewish organizations and the world outside of them were male dominated, and the men were seen as perhaps more adept at handling all this than the women. And again, a lot of women were still in the home at this point. So the short answer is no, I didn't see a lot of female activism on this one, but I know better than to say women weren't active in this period, because I know that they were.
And it would, I imagine, be the case that there were no women on these boards at that point.
No.
Okay. Would you happen?
Well, that's not entirely, well, on these boards, yes. There was Julia Richmond. She was a little bit later than this. And she was the first principal, I think, Jewish principal of it, certainly the first female Jewish principal.
Mm-hmm.
There were some, she was also a German Jew, more established. But no, you're right. In 1906, we weren't seeing women on these committees.
Would you know what the population of New York City/Brooklyn in 1906, 1907, what percentage of those citizens were Jewish? Do you happen to know?
I don't know percentage. I know that the number of Jews around this time was somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million. I can ask Alexa what the population of New York was.
We'll just go with that. Anybody else can ask their Google machine, as we say. Was Christian religious content also reduced or removed from the 100% Christian public schools, all Irish/all Italian?
Much less so. one of the things I came up with when I was doing the research here outside of New York, this was an issue in other places too. It wasn't just New York. It was New York. New York always led the pack on these things because there were so many Jews there. It was actually the largest collection of Jews that the world had ever seen in one place. But there were struggles in other places, and it did come up from time to time. But there was one example that sort of speaks to this. Somebody brought up a problem that because they were praying in the public schools, I think it was in the Midwest, and the guidance the principal gave to the teacher was, if nobody complains, it's fine. But if somebody complains, then we have to do something about it. And of course, that's still the case today. If you think that there are no more Christmas celebrations in public schools, I've got some real estate I'd like you to sell you in Gaza at this point. That's not the case. But where there are no Jews or non-Christians to complain about it, it kind of generally still goes on. It's the way it is.
The earlier well-to-do German Jewish New Yorkers would have been familiar with Christmas trees, as this was widely done by German Jews. Yes?
Yeah, there was some debate about that. There were Jews who actually did bring Christmas trees into their houses, but not most of the Russians and the Eastern Europeans. Again, the German Jews were really in a different social class from them, and their relationship with the religion, especially the Reform ones, was quite a bit different from these folks who came from the shtetls and who lived their religion 24/7 and who went to the mikvahs and who went to shul all the time. It really was a different kind of Judaism.
Which is, I'm going to just throw in a question I have. How do you think those Jews, and maybe the German Jews in terms of assimilation and not as newly arrived, might have engaged in this whole debate?
Well, I mean, we know because we know what Stern said in the committee. He basically said, this is not an issue. Big deal. So the kids sing a couple of Christmas carols, not a problem. And why are you folks making such a big deal out of it? You're embarrassing us. I mean, that really was the attitude.
Well, you have a lot of questions here. Hang on. Were there any recriminations by the school against the brave girl who started the protest?
They were, well, yes, there were. First of all, when she testified against Harding in the hearing, she was booed because he had a lot of his allies in the audience. But I think it was in PS 144. It's one of the PS. One of the schools. I think it was 144. When the girls stayed out, the seniors, there was a retaliation. They were told they were not going to have a graduation ceremony because they had stayed out of school and they had violated the rules. And what they did was they rented a hall and they had their own graduation. I was so pleased. So I guess actually, let me amend what I said about no women being involved in this. This was a little girl who had the temerity to stand up and challenge the principal, and these girls got together and they had their own ceremony. So, anybody who ever thinks that these Jewish women at any age were shrinking violets, they sure as hell didn't know my grandmother.
Did Jewish composers of secular Christmas songs weigh in?
Interesting. No, we did not hear from Irving Berlin on this one. Although he was already writing. He was already around.
The wealthy German Jews were sending their kids to private school, no?
I don't know that that's the case. I didn't find anything that suggested that they were doing that in large numbers. They may have been, I just didn't get it.
I have seen you on these programs before and have read 2 of your books.
And you've come back for more. My God, thank you, whoever you are.
Thank you. Could you share a bit about what drew you to this particular topic for this latest book, and also how hard was the research for this?
Well, if you've read some of my books, I didn't start out writing Jewish books. I started writing books about the Chinese. I wrote 4 books about early Chinese Americans, and then one about African Americans before I decided to look to my own history. And since then, it's been, I like Picasso. He had a blue period and a rose period. I've got my Chinese period, and now I'm in my Jewish period. I don't know what's next. But how I was drawn to the topic was, once I found out that this had happened, I was immediately drawn to it because this is an issue that has vexed me since childhood. this whole issue of separation and why there's so much Christianity seems to be seeping into my life, whether I want it to or not. And by the way, I'm not anti-Christmas. I know all the Christmas carols. I love listening to them. I think most of us are. It's part of being American. But that's exactly the problem. That what was going on for some of these people, they weren't necessarily trying to proselytize. But what had happened was Christianity had been conflated with Americanism, with being American and being free and being Christian. And I think a lot of the people that taught this stuff in the schools, they didn't really think much about it. They certainly weren't trying to antagonize the Jewish kids. And most of the teachers weren't trying to convert them. It was just, and even today, with Christmas has become much more secular as far as the country is concerned. It's more about shopping in the mall and buying presents and sitting in Santa's lap than it is about the birth of a savior. But I think that was what was going on. So anyway, I've always been interested in this topic, and this was an opportunity for me to explore it. As far as the research is concerned, most of my books, I lean very heavily on newspaper coverage. And there was a lot about this. The beauty of being a researcher today is that sitting in this very chair, I can do most of the research now, which would not have been the case 30 years ago. I would have been hunched over a microfilm reader at the library, hoping to find an article that I didn't even know really whether it existed or not. But with the magic of the internet and the advent of optical character recognition and keyword searches, you not only find, I can choose a topic, and within a week, I've got 2,000 articles on it on the various websites. The Library of Congress has one. There are some pay sites and there are some free sites. But not only that, but with the advent of keyword search, you find articles you did not know you were looking for. And that's the beauty of it. You put in a keyword and something shows up that you would never in a million years have searched for, or on a particular newspaper you never would have consulted. So the internet has really made this easier. That and the fact that the National Library of Israel has now a free website that has essentially historic Jewish newspapers in any language you care to mention. And Hebrew, Yiddish, Ladino, Spanish, English, all of them. And with that, plus the advent of artificial intelligence, I've devised a way now to take a Yiddish newspaper clipping, put it through optical character recognition, and essentially get a perfectly serviceable translation out of my computer, which is really mind-boggling if you think about it. Well, and so there were a lot of coverage in the Yiddish papers as well about this, and I was able to consult them with very little effort.
Interesting. I was going to ask you about that because the Yiddish Book Center, not trying to make a plug, but I'll say we worked and pioneered OCR of Yiddish, and also are working and have worked collaboratively with the National Library of Israel and with YIVO to create the Universal Library and the New York Public Library. And I was curious if you did find a lot of articles using OCR. Yiddish. Yeah.
No, I'm not really a Yiddish speaker, but I know Hebrew characters and I know how to do a keyword search in Yiddish. So I think I found a lot of the articles that even a professional researcher probably would have found.
Right.
On behalf of researchers everywhere, I want to thank you folks for your participation in this, because it opens up a part of our history that really was closed to all but Yiddish speakers before. That's not the case now.
And you, I think, get a different spin on the news sometimes.
Oh, you sure do.
It's not able to be read.
In the Kosher Meat book, I'll give you an example of it. In the Kosher Meat book, there was an article in one of the Yiddish papers about what happened on Shabbos, that the women had absolutely stopped boycotting. They stopped the street fighting, and they went to the shtibla, to the worship halls, and it gave a blow by blow of which ones, how they were received here, how somebody wanted to kick them off the bima here, and none of this appeared in the English papers. It was only in the Jewish papers. Plus, I was able to look at the socialist perspective versus the Orthodox perspective, because those papers survived for that period.
Which leads me to what may be one of our last questions. What about the socialist involvement?
Not big in this one. I mean, the foreword was there. The foreword was very much behind the protesters, but I didn't find much daylight between the socialist position and the Orthodox position. on this one. It wasn't that they were religious, but I think they believed in separation.
And what I have are many comments here,
Oh,
which, as I say, we really can't quite get to. So let me ask this as the last question, if I may. Was there any conflict between Protestant and Catholic oriented content?
yes. This whole dispute was completely a Protestant Catholic issue before the Jews showed up. There was very, very little input from the Jews in the 19th century. The problem was the Protestants got here first. The Catholics came later. They were an underclass. They were looked down on by the Protestant establishment. And they perceived the public schools as somewhat anti-Catholic. And so by the time the Jews came in and joined this messy debate, the Catholics had more or less washed their hands of the public schools. It wasn't that there weren't Catholic kids in the schools, but once they decided that the public schools were probably irredeemable, they wanted the King James Bible. The Catholics didn't use the King James Bible. Their Bible was quite a bit different and all this kind of stuff. They essentially, one of the bishops, who's considered the father of parochial schools in the United States, they deemed the public schools irredeemable, and they started setting up private schools. The debate at that point from the Catholics, and the Catholics supported the Jews to an extent in this because they liked the Jews trying to stick it to the Protestants. But they had their Chinese expression, two people in the same bed dreaming different dreams. And that was a case of this because the Jews wanted secularization in the public schools. That would make them comfortable going there. The Catholics wanted public money for the parochial schools. That was their goal in this. So they sort of supported the Jews, but for very different reasons.
Scott, thank you so much. For all of you out there, the Great Christmas Boycott of 1906 is available at shop.yiddishbookcenter.org and wherever you purchase your books, which I hope are at shop.yiddishbookcenter.org. Thank you again, Scott.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Is there another one in the works? Yes.
Well, yeah, I don't have a publisher for it yet, but as I was telling you before we started, I'm looking at the German Jews a little bit more in this next book. I've only written about the unwashed Russian Jews, my own forebears up until now, but the German Jews were pretty interesting as well. And I'm looking at particularly Louis Marshall, I'm sure you know, who was an attorney of German Jewish extraction, and some of his works. He later became, he was the head of the Jewish Theological Seminary. He was the president of Temple Emmanuel, and he was also the head of the American Jewish Committee once it was founded. So a little bit about Louis Marshall. I'll raise the kimono that high.
Okay, and we'll see you back here again. Stay in touch.
I would love it. Thank you. Thanks so much.
For all of you out there, please join us next Thursday, November 13th, when we present The Furshine Press, A Legacy Preserved. Check out our full calendar of events, virtual public programs, live events and screenings, and several book talks taking place around the country. View the calendar and register at yiddishbookcenter.org/events. Thanks to our producer, Elizabeth Carteropoli-Dearden, who makes everything run smoothly. And thanks to all of you out there, our members and supporters. Your ongoing support makes all of our work possible. So please consider renewing your membership, giving a gift membership, or if you're not a member out there, join yiddishbookcenter.org, where you can learn more. Until next time, thanks for joining us. Stay well, stay healthy, and stay in touch. Thanks.